Hello there, I am H.J. Cronin, author of fantasy, crime and horror, and I am bringing you the facts of fantasy. Thank you to all the people who have subscribed so far. It means a lot and I hope you continue to like the content. In today's video I'll be talking about my personal favourite race in all of fantasy, Dwarves. They are a race which I always choose in tabletop games, board games and video games. We will be looking into the history of them, the type of dwarves, and lastly the best bit, dwarves in fiction. Sit back, relax and enjoy. This is going to be my longest video yet, so patience and enjoy the lot. What are dwarves? Dwarves, or dwarf, depending on what lore you're reading, are a famous and popular fantasy race. They appear in both real human history and all over fantasy. Their characteristics are very familiar throughout the fiction world. Short, stout, hairy, most have beards, and the race generally lives within mountains. They're great craftsmen and women, as well as miners, much like their mythological and folklorist counterpart. When talking about dwarves though, please note I will only talk about the fantasy kind, rather than talk about the real life condition of dwarfism. History of dwarves. Similar to elves, dwarves originate in Germanic mythology. They are commonly associated with gods, wisdom, smithing, mining and crafting. In some places in Northern Europe, they were even considered demigods. It was two dwarven brothers who made Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Dwarfs were also worshipped as a type of land spirit by households. People could leave offerings for them in return for good fortune and aid in construction. Female dwarfs are rarely mentioned, however their appearance may be similar to the male dwarfs. Although many believe that the mare is a type of dark elf which gives people bad dreams, some attestations have named the mare as a dwarf. Who knows exactly where they originate from? They have appeared in many Northern European folklore, most notably the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. Perhaps people who had dwarfism in real life influenced these stories. Dwarfs certainly have a place in history that has never been rubbed out. In modern culture, they appear in books, games, TV shows and songs, from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to Tyrion in Game of Thrones. Types of dwarfs. When it comes to individual types of dwarfs in fantasy, it's very hard to decipher them, so I'll talk about two of the most common types spread throughout fantasy. You've got light variants, are your stereotypical dwarfs that dwell within mountains, long beards, wield mighty axes and love to drink ale. These are the type of dwarfs you see within Norse mythology. These have wisdom, are great craftsmen and mine gold and other jewels. Tolkien is the one that really has brought the dwarven race to the fantasy tabletop, and it is his dwarf race that has created a template for all dwarf races throughout fantasy. Dark variants are the other types. These come in the form of Druga, or Chaos Dwarfs. They are dwarfs whose blood have been corrupted by darkness and evil. Their skin is grey and they seldom leave their tunnels and mountains. They're usually the arch enemy of their lighter counterparts, much like the light and dark elves. There's a lot of similarities between the two. In fiction. For this section, I will pick out 5 famous fantasy realms where dwarfs dwell and briefly speak about each of them. I deliberately left the previous 2 sections short, as this category is busy and there's a lot to get through. Number 1. Middle Earth. With much inspiration and hard work, Tolkien created dwarves as we know them today. Dwarves are a short, stocky race, a little taller than the hobbits, but much broader and heavier. Most dwarves have thick, luxuriant beards in which they take great pride, and often fork or braid them and tuck them into their belts. They seem to favour simple durable clothing, coloured hoods and heavy cloaks for travelling, and belts of gold or silver. For battle, their soldiers would have worn elaborately crafted armour and helmets, bearing various angles and styles that are trademarks of dwarven crafting styles. Dwarven women are alike in manner, voice and appearance to their menfolk. They are few in number, less than a third of all dwarf kind in fact, and they are seldom seen outside their own halls, often not venturing far due to their duties as caretakers and crafters in dwarven society. They typically only travel when in great need, and they usually dress similarly to the men. This often led other folk to believe there were no dwarf women among the dwarves, and that dwarves grow from stone when created, or out of holes in the ground, like Gimli says in the Two Towers. Few female dwarven warriors were known, but some tales say that female dwarfs were as fierce as their male counterparts, especially in protecting their families and offspring. Dwarves are usually monogamous and fewer than 1/3 of dwarf men took a wife, the rest busying themselves with their crafts. The dwarves were created by Ule, and Ule was unwilling to wait for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, for he was impatient and desired to have someone teach his lore and craft. Therefore he made the first 7 fathers of the dwarves in secret in a hall under the mountains of Middle-earth. It was, however, not within Ule's power to create life. After being reprimanded by Ilúvatar and realising his error, Ule offered his creations to his father to do with as he would, including their destruction. Even as the offer was made, Ilúvatar accepted and gave the dwarves a life of their own. So when Ule picked up a great hammer to smite the 7 fathers and destroy his presumptuous creations, they shrank back in fear and begged for mercy. Ilúvatar was however not willing to suffer that the dwarves should come before the firstborn, elves, and he decreed that the 7 fathers should sleep underground and not come forth until the firstborn had awakened. During the First Age, the dwarves of Nogrod were famous for craftsmanship of their weapons. Most notable among their sifts was Telchar. Dwarves from Nogrod crafted the necklace of Nauglamir, and Thingol requested dwarven smiths from Nogrod set a silmaril into that necklace. Thus were united the greatest works of elves and dwarves. Those dwarf smiths were driven mad by gold lust, however, and murdered Thingol and stole the necklace and the stone, igniting a bitter rivalry between dwarves and elves that raged between the two races until the end of the Third Age. And so the dwarves lived through the First and Second Ages. 50,000 of Durin's folk helped in the battles of the last alliance, wrongly branded in my opinion as alliance between elves and men, because there were dwarves involved as well. In the Third Age, after centuries of greedy digging for mithril and other minerals, the dwarves woke a Balrog. The dwarves fled Khazad-dûm, which would then be known as Moria, plagued by orcs, trolls and goblins. Most of Durin's folk left for the Grey Mountains in the north, while some followed the new king, Thrain I, who briefly went to Erebor. For more than 300 years the dwarves of the Grey Mountains prospered, until the dragons in the far north started to gain strength. Some fled to the Iron Hills, while most followed the new king Thror to Erebor to start a new kingdom under the mountain. There they prospered for over 200 years, until the dragon Smaug descended. The king and his company went in exile into south, while most of the survivors went to the Iron Hills. Durin's folk settled in Dunland, and King Thror travelled north to Moria, where he was killed by the goblin king Azog. Thror's son, Thrain II, who had received the last of the 7 rings for his father before his departure, summoned all the houses of the dwarves to war. Thus began the War of Dwarves and Orcs, which is my favourite in the whole lore of Lord of the Rings, being a dwarf lover and all, in which the dwarves destroyed all the goblin strongholds in the Misty Mountains, culminating to the great battle of Azunulibazar, where all the dwarven clans united. The goblins' host issuing from Moria were strong and relentless until the arrival of fresh dwarves of the Iron Hills. The battle ended with a victory of dwarves, but at great cost. The dwarven clans, however, were unwilling to repopulate Moria. Thrain therefore came to the Blue Mountains and established his realm from there. The wizard Gandalf was instrumental in helping Thrain's son, Thorin, in reclaiming the kingdom of Erebor. Thorin gathered around him 12 dwarves, mostly from his own line, and was joined by Gandalf and Bilbo Baggins. The quest for Erebor ended with the death of Smaug. After a quarrel with the men and elves of the unguarded hoard of gold, the dwarves, assisted by those from the Iron Hills, united with the men and elves to fight the attacking goblins and wargs in what was to be called the Battle of the 5 Armies, where Thorin Oakenshield was killed. Read the Hobbit book, it's better than the movies, and it's by far one of the best fantasy books ever written. Go out and get it now if you haven't read The Hobbit already, you need to read it. Gimli, son of Gloin, joined the Fellowship of the Ring as a representative of the dwarves, and befriended Legolas during the War of the Ring. After the Battle of the Pelennor Field, a force of 30,000 Longbeards against 200,000 men of Rhûn, who had taken all the Bran's lands, leaving only his capital city of Dale. The dwarves and men of Dale stood for 3 days against the Easterlings, and once the news of Sauron's death spread to the Lonely Mountain, the Easterlings retreated. having lost over 100,000 troops as opposed to the defenders who only lost 14,000 dwarves and 12,000 men. The sturdy nature of the mountain rock, combined with the dwarven masonry and the dwarven quality of the defenders' weapons, reduced the hitting power of the Easterlings, 2 armed catapults and semi-automatic ballistas, and allowed the defenders to drive the attackers from the mountain and out of Bran's realm. During the Fourth Age, which began after the destruction of Mordor and Sauron, dwarves and men reforged their friendship. Dain was killed during the War of the Ring and was succeeded by his son Thorin III, Stonehelm, who ruled well into the Fourth Age. During this time, dwarves from the Lonely Mountain helped rebuild cities in Gondor and the fortress of Helm's Deep, and some went to newly established dwarven realm of the Glittering Caves, where Gimli was lord. Nevertheless, the kingdom of the Lonely Mountain apparently continued to prosper throughout the Fourth Age. As you can tell, I'm so passionate about the dwarven lore in Middle-earth, such as all the info about the Durin's folk. Trust me, go and read about it, it's awesome. In fact, the lore outside of the Lord of the Rings books is amazing. There is so much content there for you to read. Notable dwarves: Gimli, Durin, Dain, Thrain, the company that travelled with Bilbo. They are Balin, Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, Dori, Nori, Ori, Dwalin, Gloin, Oin, Keely, Feely, and Thorin Oakenshield. That was a mouthful. Now, let's get on to the next part. Number 2. Dungeons and Dragons / Forgotten Realms. Dwarves were a short race, as their name implied, with gold dwarves being a bit shorter. What dwarves lacked in height they made up for in bulk. They were, on average, about as heavy as humans. Dwarven males were a bit taller and heavier than their female counterparts. Like humans, dwarves had a wide variety of skin, eye and hair colours, typically pale among shield dwarves and deeply tanned or brown amongst golden dwarves. Hazel eyes were common throughout the race, with blue eyes more common amongst the shield dwarves and brown or green eyes found amongst the gold dwarves. Male dwarves were often bald and grew thick facial hair, sometimes used to display social status. Unusually for humanoids, both sexes naturally grew ample facial hair, though the majority of shield dwarf females shaved their beards off. This hair was often dark in hue, though among shield dwarves blonde or red hair was just as common. Gold dwarves took care of the facial hair to an extreme, carefully oiling and grooming it, with some adding perfume and ornaments to it, and lavish decorations. Dwarves were a long-lived race, though not so much as the Tel Quaesir, and reached physical maturity somewhat later than humans. A dwarf was traditionally considered an adult once he or she reached age 50. Dwarves age much more like humans, but over a longer period of time, remaining vigorously well past 150 years. Most dwarves lived to see their bicentennial, and a few lived to be over 400. Dwarves were usually tough for humanoids, in more ways than one. Dwarven stomachs, for instance, were resistant to virtually all poisons, and it took less effort for a dwarf to get back on his feet than other races. Dwarves also had dense bodies and were difficult to push around as a result, as well as having the capacity to bear loads that other races might find hindering with little ill effort. The dwarves also had a sense about them that few races did, with a preternatural awareness of their surroundings, useful for subterranean race, as well as good judgment all around in general. Many dwarves were difficult to like and lacked the charm of many other smaller races, such as halflings or gnomes, though this was not a trait common to all dwarves, and some possessed a great deal of characteristic power. Furthermore, dwarves were not entirely unsocial, and more than a few had a natural knack for bartering or judging the value of an offer, something that sit well with their legendary crafting abilities. It was occasionally believed that dwarves possessed the ability to see in the blackest darkness, like a drow, and there was evidence that this might be true, though it was also possible that the tales were misheard recollection of Drugar, who were often mistaken for dwarves. However, many dwarves did have an affinity in other ways for the caverns in which they lived, possessing a natural affinity for recognising unusual patterns in stonework that could be almost seen as supernatural at times. Dwarves did not forgive past wrongs easily, and the entire race had more or less declared war on goblins and orcs as a whole, wiping them out wherever they found them. Many dwarves viewed these races as foul infestations of their mountain homes, and their duty to purge them. Likewise, many dwarves viewed drow and grimlocks with similar hatred, and few dwarves had forgotten their ancestral hatred of the giants who once enslaved them. Because of this, dwarves generally viewed related races such as half-orcs with distrust. Dwarves got along pretty well with gnomes, with whom they shared a love for fine crafting, and passably with humans, and half-elves and halflings. However, most dwarves commonly believed that true friendships can only be forged over long periods of time, and a common saying was that the difference between an acquaintance and a friend is about 100 years, meaning that few members of the shorter-lived races ever forged strong bonds with dwarves. There were exceptions, however. Some of the strongest friendships were those between dwarf and human, whose grandparents and parents were also on good terms with the dwarf. Types of dwarfs. There existed several dwarven sub-races. The best known are the following: Arctic dwarfs, squat and hardy dwarves from the isolated northern reaches of Faerun. Gold dwarfs, strong and muscular dwarves, with tan skin from the south, largely in the Great Rift area. Shield dwarves, tall dwarves by comparison who populate the northern reaches of western central Faerun. Urduni dwarves, stocky and muscular dwarves, live in the Underdark. Wild dwarves, primitive dark-skinned dwarves, primarily from the jungles of Chult. Duergar. The Duergar were a closely related race of humanoids, but separated from generations of divergence, slavery, and under the Illithids and the infusion of diabolic blood. They held themselves to be a separate race completely, and were often insulted if compared to service dwarfs. Notable dwarfs: Ivan and Pickle Bouldershoulder, Brunir Battlehammer from Drizzt. Number 3. World of Warcraft. Dwarves are short and stout creatures, mostly inhabiting Khazmodan in the Eastern Kingdoms. They are shorter than humans, but taller than gnomes, taking advantage of their size when possible, and relying on their robustness and strength when not. The males have beards, typically a long wild beard, sometimes with hair to match. Female dwarves are also short as well as stout, albeit to a lesser degree. They rarely appear to have beards, although there are instances of bearded females, typically among Warhammer dwarves. Female dwarves who sported strong beards are considered a sign of beauty among members of the Warhammer dwarves. The average dwarf is steady, observant, and composed, both during work and combat, yet able to rage with fierce zeal and persistence when the situation calls for it. While a dwarf prefers to plan forward to overcome challenges, many of them easily lose their temperament and self-restraint when exposed to conditions stirring their feelings and concerns. In past ages, the dwarves rarely left their safety of the mountain fortresses, spending their time on refining metal and stone into powerful weapons and beautiful jewellery. However, when the call to battle sounded, they rose up to defend their friends and allies with unmatched courage and valour. King Magni Bronzebeard led the Kingdom of Iron-Forged Dwarves to become one of the most staunch members of the Alliance. Currently, the three main dwarven clans are led by the Council of Three Hammers. The dwarves and their progenitors, also known as the Earthen, interaction with the other races and factions, has mostly related to the Alliance. Albeit the dwarves are the major actors in this event, Earthen were also called upon to join an alliance of various races during the War of the Ancients. While the Alliance did not actually exist during this time, the name is probably referring to the gathering of various leaders whose races later would join the future alliance. Some of the leaders were actually sent from the future when the alliance did not exist, such as Ronin. This event was probably the first time the Earthing encountered races like humans and dragons. As said, the now fleshed dwarves have played a much greater role in the alliance. While the dwarves in Northrend have stayed rather inactive and never ventured far away from Ulduar, the dwarves emerging from Ulduman have travelled across much of the world and interacted with many other races. They encountered the humans, perhaps the most important allies. Gilneas and Alterac, strong supporters of Strom and the Arathor Empire, had developed mighty armies that explored the mountains southern lands of Khazad-Modan. It was during this period that the humans first met the ancient race of dwarves and travelled to their cavernous subterranean city of Ironforge. The humans and dwarves shared many secrets of metalsmithing and engineering, discovered a common love for battle and storytelling. Interaction between the Dwarves and humans increased, and the two races soon became allies. For instance, it was the humans who taught the Dwarves how to write in common. The humans also introduced the Dwarves to the Holy Light. The Dwarves on their side used their knowledge to craft powerful weapons for the humans, such as Ashbringer. 200 years ago, the Dwarves also met the Gnomes, whom the Dwarves shared a flair of technology and engineering with. The Dwarves were impressed with the ingenuity and quickness of their smaller kin. Since this union began, the Gnomes and Dwarves have often been treated as one faction instead of two. Their frequent collaborations resulted in the creation of some of the Alliance's most amazing devices and weapons. Thus the Union has served the Alliance well, supplying Alliance armies with heavy artillery, mortars, submarines, mechanical contraptions, siege engines and flying machines. One of the most important events that strengthened this friendship was the building of Gnomeregan, which both races contributed to the city's construction. When Gnomeregan later was overtaken by Trogs after the Third War, the Gnome refugees moved to Ironforge in order to plan a counter-attack. These four races would further join together during the Second War, when the humans sought the aid of the various kingdoms inhabiting Lordaeron in the battle against the Horde. Originally, only the humans were invited, but races such as the Dwarves and High Elves applied as well when they saw their lands being ravaged. Political leaders like King Tyrannus Menethil and Anduin Lothar gathered the Dwarves of the Ironforge and Wildhammer clans, Gnomes, High Elves and humans into the alliance of Lordaeron, which ultimately defeated the Horde and laid ground for the present-day alliance. Although this organisation has changed much since then, with the departure of some members like most of the High Elves, now known as Blood Elves, and the gaining of new members like the Draenei and the Night Elves, Dwarves still stand as one of the core parts of the Alliance. Types of Dwarfs in World of Warcraft. Dark Dwarf. Dark Iron Dwarves have darkish grey and black skin, with red glowing eyes. Since the Battle of Azeroth, their hair grows slightly and embers flake off the ends. They are fire resistant. Frostborn. From a distance, the Frostborn look like any other normal dwarf, but upon closer examination, you're able to see that their skin is noticeably light blue colour, almost like ice. Upon even closer examination, the Frostborn have similar marks on them as those of the Earthen. This may mean that the Frostborn are Earthen, who had adapted to the harsh cold of Northrend. Hill Dwarf. Hill Dwarf is a term for a subrace of dwarves that live permanently in the hills. Mountain Dwarves. Mountain Dwarves is a term for a subrace of dwarves that live primarily in the mountains. Notable Dwarves. Modimus, Anvil Mar. Madaron Bronzebeard. Cardros Wildhammer. Rom, Sorcerer Thane Thrawisan. Modgud, Franklorn Fraudrite. Number 4. Elder Scrolls. Be prepared for something very different from the Elder Scrolls universe, but just as awesome as the others. In Elder Scrolls, they're known as Dwemer, who were an ancient lost race of Mer, who were the remnants of an early Aldmer and lived primarily in the region of Dwemereth. Mer used the term Dwemer, roughly translated as people of the deep. The term also connoted deep delving or profound and close counselled. Men commonly referred to them as dwarfs, in reference to the fables of the giants, seeing them as small. So yes, they're actually elves, but are referred to as dwarves, which is strange, but they do make it onto this list under dwarfs, or my list anyway. The Dwemer were an advanced race and civilization, in many respects far ahead of the other races and civilizations of their time. They are well known for their skill and revolutionary developments in technology, engineering, crafting methods, metalwork, stonework, architecture, city planning, science, mathematics, magic, and the academic arts. The Dwemer are known for playing a huge role in one of the greatest mysteries in all of Tamriel. In 1E700, during the Battle of the Red Mountain, for reasons still debated and circumstances still being studied, the Dwemer seemingly disappeared. It is still debated who or what caused the Dwemer to disappear, as well as whether they disappeared all at once or over a period of time. Essays, stories, legends and tales have generally described the appearances and personality of the Dwemer race in general, but not of individuals. In appearance, the Dwemer were believed to be sized similarly to average elf or human, though occasionally likened to large children with beards. Other supporting evidence includes visual sculptures and dwarven spectres that roam the halls within their ruined dwellings, which indicate that the Dwemer preferred heavy metal armour and robes, most of which are made out of either armoured shells of ancient mechanical men or mismatched pieces of various devices. Dwemer cities were vast, expansive, containing living spaces, dwellings, study rooms, areas for scientific, academic, engineering and arcane study, workshops, pumping stations, pump houses and boileries. Other sections included aerodromes and sky domes, which contained ocularities, debate halls, war quarters, cathedrals, marketplaces, treasuries, armories, storage areas, storerooms and gatehouses. These areas were interconnected with great halls and long passageways running throughout the Dwemer's underground cities. Some sections of Dwemer cities were sectioned and named for a specific role. The Arcanex was a section of a city used for arcane study, and observational studies have shown that the Arcanex in Berthodams contained a surprising collection of soul gems. The Dwemer were masters of crafting and smithwork and made many innovations in the art as well. Dwemer people of this trade forged weapons, armour, tools and other materials in their day before the disappearance of their race. A unique ability was only known as ancient knowledge, was an ability that granted a wearer of dwarven armour 25% bonus and smith increase 15% faster. This knowledge was contained within the lexicon. Little is known of the history of the Dwemer and the early history and origins of their civilization. Conflicts with other races were very frequent, as was infighting. As such, the timeline is not entirely accurate for many of these events. Recorded history dates the beginning of the Dwemer in the Meroitic era, though it could not be said that the earliest known history of the Dwemer was when the Adria created Mundus, the mortal realm, and with it all of the mortal races. Notable Dwemer: Dumak, Yagrum Bagam, Nunchak, and Munch End. Number 5. Warhammer. Aside from Middle-earth, Warhammer offers my second favourite piece of dwarf lore. Their lore is so extensive and detailed, I cannot fit it all in this little segment. It may have to be a future video on its own. So I'll give them a brief overview and then some information about their military might. The Dwarfs, or Darway as they call themselves, are currently one of the oldest and proudest races in the Warhammer world, with a great wealth of history and power that stretches back since time immemorial. They once held an empire which stretched from Norsca in the north to the jungles in the south, and from Mount Silverspear in the east to the Grey Mountains in the west. However, the heart of the Dwarfen realm, the Khazar Angkor as they call it, will always lie within the domains of the World's Edge Mountains, the highest mountain range in the world. It is filled with magnificent halls and holes of the Dwarfen people, a testament to the great feats of engineering and power once wielded by this ancient civilization. The Dwarf people as a whole are sturdy and strong, brilliant craftsmen and excellent warriors, but above all they prize themselves on their loyalty to each other and to those they are indebted to. This strong bond of kinship has ensured that the Dwarfs are considered amongst the most united races in the face of the world. They are known far and wide as the greatest miners and tunnellers in the world. The ageless halls of Karazakarak are but one gigantic example of how their works can become. As expected, the Dwarfs are highly proficient smiths and craftsmen, capable of producing works far more beautiful than the elven metalworkers in Far Ulthuan, and hundreds of times more valuable than the trinkets of men. Proud, honourable and enduring, it is said that the Dwarfs shall weather the horrors and misery of the world until its bitter end. Forged by centuries of constant warfare, the Dwarfs have become a race of hardened warriors who remember every affront slighted against them, answering their High King's summons. The Dwarfs march from their mountain strongholds in great throngs of doughty, steel-clad infantry, supported by powerful war machines of indescribable firepower. At the fore, mighty heroes bearing matchless runic weapons and armour stand ready to deliver the death blow that shall avenge the indignities that have fallen before their race. Such is the constant fierce wars that these brave warriors have fought over the centuries, that each mountain kingdom is more than a heavily militarised fortress city. teeming with the uncountable armies of battle-hardened veterans of 100 battles. Each dwarf has already the physique of a natural warrior, with body and arms as thick as tree trunk, a mental conscience as stubborn as a rock, and overlapping armour of unbreakable dwarf steel that covers the dwarf from head to toe. However, contrary to popular belief, the dwarfs do not necessarily have a standing full-time professional military, but instead they rely on their clans to provide soldiers for them. In times of war, members of dwarf clan will form their own militia regiments of warriors, quarrellers and thunderers under the leadership of a thane. Once formed up, they would rally alongside the leaders of a military expedition or campaign, and form into an army or a throng. With the superior craftsmanship of the dwarf, each warrior is equipped with some of the finest weapons and armour the world has ever known, as unbreakable as the mountains themselves, and as bone-crushing as the blow of an avalanche. A dwarf warrior excels greatly at close-quarter combat, where their armour and weapons are used to great effect, and as such, they are expert tunnel fighters. The dwarfs are also the leading experts in the most advanced technology ever possessed by any mortal race today, being the first to discover the potential of steam engines and gunpowder. The dwarven race are a race of engineers as well as warriors, unsurpassed in all avenues of science and technology, and hindered only by the highly strict traditions imposed by their elders and their societies. Under the watchful guidance of the dwarves, the Empire of Man is also rapidly catching up with their advancement, and may soon replace them as a technological superpower. While the dwarfs make up for with strength, craftsmanship and durability, they lack greatly in speed, magic and numbers. Dwarfs lack all forms of cavalry, instead rely on heavy aerial support in the means of gyrocopters and gyrobombers for quick and reliable attacks and reconnaissance. Dwarfs are totally immune to touch of magic and thus have no magic wielders. However, they compensate this fault by using runesmiths, a dwarf who has the ability to use runes that can manipulate the flow of magic for their own uses. But probably the largest weakness that befalls all dwarf armies is their insufficient numbers. A large army of dwarf standards are only in a few hundreds, and this great lack of manpower has always hindered the dwarfs greatly, making sure that every dwarf loss in combat is a severe blow to both the battle and the survival of their race. On the battlefield, dwarven armies excel greatly as stubborn immobile walls of powerful infantry, supported by massive batteries of lethal war machines. When fighting on the defensive, the dwarfs would position themselves at the most narrow points within a battle, where they would form a shield wall of heavy armoured infantry at the front, with supporting regiments of siege equipment and riflemen at the back at an elevated position. The tactics being employed is simple attrition, where the dwarfs would stand defiantly against their enemies and absorb as much of their punishment like water on rock. After several hours, their enemies would grow tired, broken, and would retreat the battlefield. Solid and dependable, the dwarfs are experts in wars of attrition and underground warfare. When on the rare occasions that dwarfs take the fight to the enemy, their armies would fight in a tight formation, advancing against the enemy slowly and methodically, in almost grim silence. When showered by enemy bolts, the dwarfs would raise their shields and absorb the incoming missiles, while still would keep at a steady foreboding pace. As the dwarfs' own missiles and artillery rained down upon the enemy, the dwarfs would then engage them headlong in close combat. The sub-races. Norse Dwarf. Norse dwarfs are a very outlandish group that once held a large position in Norska as their mountain realm. Their main kingdom, known as Karak-Adrak, is located west of Norska. Grey Dwarfs. Grey Dwarfs is a term used to refer to the colonists whom have lost their former homes within the World's Edge Mountains and now made a new life within the less hostile Grey Mountains. Imperial Dwarf. The Imperial Dwarfs are dwarfs that have made a new life within the Empire of Man, giving their services up at a high price and aiding their heirs of Sigmar, the greatest friend of the dwarf. While relationships with these three variants are usually peaceful, there is one breed of dwarf that every citizen of the Karaz Angkor despises: the Chaos Dwarf. Chaos Dwarfs are the descendants of those dwarfs that wandered east and turned from the ancient gods when the tide of chaos advanced. These dwarfs bear minor physical mutations like tusks, and in rare cases horns and cloven hooves. Evil, evil dwarfs. Notable dwarfs: Thorgrim Grudgebearer, Ungrim Ironfist, Belagor Ironhammer, Uthor, Grombrindale, Crag the Grim. There are many fantasy books and movies and games which feature dwarves. Even I myself couldn't resist putting them in one of my books, for I love their aura, and there's just something about them I love. Whether it's their grim, their weaponry, their armour, or just their keen on drinking personalities, I don't know what it is, but I absolutely love dwarves. So there you have it. I hope you found it interesting, and possibly even learned something new. I'll be back soon to speak about another fantasy race, who's yet to be decided. I'll announce it at some point, I'm not too sure. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Let's aim for 1 like again. Actually no, let's make it 2 likes. Also, why not subscribe to be the first to find out when a new video is uploaded. I am HJ Cronin and I am signing out. Until next time, goodbye.